Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Joustra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be talking about the regenerative garden, nurturing nature through sustainable gardening practices, with Eva Monheim, who is a horticultural and environmental consultant and educator. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you doing, Gabriella?
I'm good, other than struggling with regenerative, which if I might make mistakes throughout the podcast, so please bear with me. But other than that, I'm pretty good. How are you today?
Great, really good, and it is a hard word.
Yeah. So that we get to know you a bit better, how did you get into this area? And do you mind introducing yourself a bit?
I've been in the horticulture field since I've been a really young girl. I started as maybe about 5 years old. My father and mother's side of the family were farmers over in Europe. And then when they came here, they had gardens, they had avid gardens, and my aunt and uncle owned a farm. So we spent a lot of time at the farm and learning how to plant and pick. And then as I grew up and continued to garden at home, at my parents' home, I really found a passion in that, collecting seeds and finding new types of seeds and planting the garden, canning, cooking, all of that, besides all my other activities like art and design, that kind of thing. But when I went on to college, I chose to go for horticulture. And that was really exciting because I was going to one of the premier schools in our state of Pennsylvania, the Penn State University. And it was a really wonderful time because there was a lot of things happening in the horticulture field that were new and I guess I want to say different, one including hydroponics and looking at how nuclear reactors affect seed and all kinds of things. And to me, that was really fascinating, and also the opportunity to see how things were done at the university level in big greenhouses, going out into the field and seeing what they looked like when we were out in the field. So it was really wonderful. It's a good education.
Mm-hmm. It sounds very interesting. Seeing what nuclear power or nuclear fission does to plants and all that kind of stuff. Wow, very complex. And it seems like you have a very varied interest, though, with art, design, and also horticulture.
I do, and I have my other degree. While I was going to university for 4 years, I got my horticulture degree, and then I decided I was going to get my art degree at the same time. So I worked the two together, and I just never thought of separating them. I always felt like they belong together because horticulture means the art of cultivation. So I feel like that's really ingrained in me.
Wow, I love that. And we're going to get to know you a little bit better with a section we call Have You Met Eva? So the first thing we'd like to know is, what is your favorite book?
Oh, books. Well, my favorite scientific book in horticulture is called Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. I love the book. It has inspired me to do many various paintings and drawings. But I really love it because I've always felt that plants communicate, and people would look at me like I'm crazy when I would say, of course plants speak. Of course plants talk. They just don't talk like we do. They communicate. And, I would get the eye roll. and I would say, well, do you think that we're the only ones who communicate? I just could never understand that, that humans could be that arrogant to think that nothing else on the planet communicates.
Mm. How do they communicate? I guess there's many various organisms and they'll communicate in different ways, but could you give maybe one or two examples?
Sure. The more recent findings, a friend of mine who has been the longest running garden columnist in the United States, Jeff Lowenfeld, he wrote 3 books called the trilogy about mycorrhiza and bacteria and nutrients and how they actually cross the cell membranes in the root of the plant. The soil, as we think, we've thought for a very long time that soil is not living. It's there just to supply nutrients, but it is just as dynamic and a living organism like we are. And there are living organisms in the soil that actually help promote nutrient uptake, whether for example, rhizophagy actually goes into the cells of the plants and breaks it open so that they can take advantage of the nutrients, and then they go back out into the soil and then they come back into the plant, and that process goes back and forth. And it's the same with mycorrhiza, which is a fungi. When I was teaching at the university, I had a student who discovered a new dyeing technique for looking at endo mycorrhiza, or endo, and then there's also ecto, which is outside the root. Endo is inside. And she was able to stain the roots and discover how many mycorrhiza were actually in the root of an oak tree, for example. Mm-hmm. And that was really fascinating to everybody. And not only to the faculty, but also to the students. And she later on became a doctor. And that paper actually set her apart from everyone else entering university, because she came up with this new technique of staining the roots of a plant at the university in undergraduate school. So
wow,
it's pretty fascinating.
That's very impressive for undergraduates. So are they using the fungi or the fungi to communicate, or are they communicating with the fungi?
They actually do communicate, and they will. What happens is, and in Suzanne Smart's book, she talks about how a birch tree can offer its water, if it has too much water, to the spruce. And the spruce can offer nutrients that the birch might not have to the birch. So that interaction between root systems are happening through the mechanisms of bacteria and fungi and rhizophagy. And so when you separate a community, it's like separating, how here in the United States, we've had this controversial thing with the Mexican border where the children were being separated from their parents. And it's the worst thing you could possibly do, because there's a lack of communication, there's a lack of understanding. And it's that spiral that happens to plants when you strip a field of everything and just put a plant in it and expect the plant to grow when there's nothing else around. I mean, we don't leave our babies on the roadside and expect them to grow by themselves and to get food by themselves. We just don't do that. And yet we expect plants to do it. And those fields that have other plants in it will actually help nurture up the plant, the young plant that's growing. So when there's also a method called Miyawaki method of growing forests, for example. When you plant hundreds of trees and shrubs together, all around the same size in a plot, they will all grow in unison. And as they grow in unison, trying to compete for the food, they will keep growing and growing and growing, and some will outcompete the others, and eventually some will die. But they will continue to compete for the resources and also share the resources that they're not using. So that to me is really a way to communicate. It's just like when somebody puts food on the table, and you know, they may not be there, but they put the food on the table. Well, guess what? You know that they left you something to eat.
Mm-hmm.
So have something to eat. Don't just leave it sit there. Utilize it. And maybe even ask somebody else to come in to utilize it too. It's that same kind of process.
That's interesting. I mean, I guess I've always thought about plants as just these things that grow, and they don't, you know, I have my plants in little pots, so they can't communicate with anything else. So it's interesting to think that maybe I should plant them all in a big pot so they can share and talk to each other. It's like having, it's like how they say with pets, you know, you should always have two pets so they can, you know, talk to each other and be together all the time rather than having one lonely pet. So yeah, I think that today is going to change how I think about plants.
Well, there's another woman in another book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer. And Robin Kimmerer is a native indigenous person here in the United States. And what I found in listening to her, because we had her talk at one of our conferences, and she said that the word kin, K-I-N, means a relationship. So when we talk about plants, we can talk about them as kin to us because we have a relationship with them. So they're not its, they are kin. So you never want to treat them like they're non-living or they're nothing more than a castaway. They're not. They're providing things for us that make them kin to us. So that's another way to look at plants and how, you know, we may shift our paradigm and how we think about them and how we value them. Or, you know, those people who don't value them, you know, the people who don't value them don't understand. And usually when there's a lack of understanding, there's a lack of abuse. I mean, there's actually abuse that occurs when there's a lack of understanding. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think we see that with unfortunately a lot of things. You know, if you don't understand something, if you don't understand that, you know, plants are living things, if you don't understand that pets have I guess a right to be treated well, if we don't understand that other people are people, then we tend to abuse them and neglect them.
Yeah, and a good example when you're talking about pets, you know, the idea of having a pet and someone saying, well, they don't have feelings. Of course they have feelings, but not like ours. They interact in a different way. And it's the same thing with plants, for example. They do have feelings because we've done numerous experiments at the university where students would have the plants listening to music. And invariably, they would grow faster, they would respond better. The plants that were neglected and not talked to and shunned, they stayed short and didn't grow as well, as healthy. And so those kind of examples can be shown over and over and over again. And so understanding that plants can communicate and whether we want to listen or not, that's another story. There's a thing here that most recently that they discovered about plants and nighttime light, for example. Nighttime light is bad for humans, but it's also bad for plants and animals outside. What they discovered is that plants actually stretch at nighttime. They stretch their cells and they're more elastic and more plastic. And they can exercise themselves in the darkness. And as light starts to come on, they start to shrink back to their regular size or whatever size they were. And then they go back to their photosynthesizing, etc. But during that time when they're not photosynthesizing, they're stretching.
Interesting. I'm going to have to, maybe I'll do my own little experiment with my plants. I'll get 2 plants and I'll put one outside where it can stretch and there's no light, and I'll put one inside. Might be a bit of a heat difference. Maybe I'll do it in summer.
Whenever, yeah.
Yeah, and then I'll see if one grows better than the other.
They have the opportunity to stretch. It's just like us. If we don't have a chance to stretch and, move our muscles and our legs, and who knew that plants stretched until they started to do these experiments.
I know, that's so interesting. We're going to move on to our next question, so we get to know a little bit more about you. Do you listen to any podcasts?
I do. The Hidden Brain. And the other one is, hold on, Planet Money and How I Built This. Those are ones that, oh gosh, I can listen to those all day. How did people, struggle to get to where they are to be successful, and building a business, and how does that happen? How many times you tried before you were successful? And where did the money come from? Who funded it? That's the other part. And of course, the hidden brain, all the fascinating things that are going on in our brains that we have no idea are happening. That to me is incredible.
Yes, I listened to 2 of those 3 podcasts, and I've heard a lot of great things about how I built this as well. So I think I should put it into my rotation.
Good.
I mean, there's just so many podcasts out there.
There are.
So yeah, those, obviously great picks because I like them. So
I'm sorry I didn't give you more that you didn't know about.
No, I like it when people suggest things that I listen to, because number one, we're also suggesting for our listeners.
Yes.
But also makes me feel good that I am listening to some interesting podcasts.
Yes. And it is true. The more that we listen to certain things that actually expand our minds, we can actually expand how we view the earth and the universe.
Yes. So many podcasts have taught me so many things that I apply directly into my life nowadays. I don't necessarily think I apply everything I learn because there's so many things, but I think it influences me in so many different ways. And I think, Planet Money and Hidden Brain are 2 that I really think about a lot.
Yeah, that they're ones that I try not to miss when they're on.
And do you have a role model?
I can honestly say that I've had many role models through my life. I've had shaman role models. I've had 7 of those, and I've had really wonderful teachers. My biology teacher in high school, she was a good role model. I still am in touch with her today, and surprisingly, she belongs to a garden club, so sometimes I speak with her garden club. But she was always really fascinating to me. Just the information that she would impart and the passion with which she imparted it made me want to learn more about science.
I think that having those role models really early on is also really important, because they really do help to shape your life.
They do. They really do. And of course, I had good role models in my parents and family members who were very talented. And I know that I watched my mom a lot. She was a tailor, and I learned how to sew from her and watched her do her artwork. And, that to me was really, really an opportunity to learn.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And have you completed any courses that have inspired you?
Oh, this is a good one. I've taken hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of courses. And I really value my Reiki classes. I'm a Reiki master teacher.
What is Reiki? Sorry.
Reiki. Well, that's okay. Reiki is working with the unseen energy within the human and helping shift energy, help the physical body as well as the or a body to move if it's stuck. It's fascinating. And that was, you have to take there's 3 levels of Reiki. And I felt that has changed my life. When I was studying abroad in England, I met a friend who was studying there also. And before we left the university, he gave me 3 resumes, his mother's, his father's, and his, and all 3 of them were Reiki people. His mother was a Reiki master teacher, his father was a Reiki master, and he was a Reiki practitioner. And I came back, and lo and behold, my friend had become a Reiki practitioner. So I said to her, where do I go? And that's how it started. So I do that. And then I also felt really important, the important thing about meditation, going to meditation classes and learning from my different shamans. They taught a lot about meditation and rebirthing and then mindfulness. And I have a really wonderful gentleman who teaches our mindfulness classes on Saturdays. And he's studied with a lot of people around the world. And just the fact that he can get us to remain silent in our minds is really important and also gratitude.
Wow, you certainly have done a lot of courses and you're very, very knowledgeable in so many different areas.
I think it's important when you're teaching that you need to be able to bring different topics in for students to latch onto. So if it might not be the plant, it might be something else about the plant. It could be a medicinal about the plant. It could be an insect that has a relationship with that plant. Or it could be that plant as a wholesome edible that will provide a nutrient that maybe somebody might have a deficiency in.
Yeah, thank you. So how do you define household management?
Household management. Oh, this was a big thing in our life. My mother was a home economist.
Oh, wow.
And she was very well trained. And so we learned, how to do what, when, and, how to time your meal so that it all came together at the same time and that you put it on the table at the same time. How to prepare things and clean up as you go so that you don't have mountains of messes everywhere, or to create outdoor spaces that are just as important as inside spaces. Welcome yourself to your front door with beautiful plants, because who else deserves it more than you after coming home after a long day? Or entering your back door that may be where your car is parked, and there is a beautiful plant or garden that smells good as you walk into the house in the evening. Those kind of things are part of the home as far as economics goes. And from a monetary standpoint, what do you place value on within the house? Do you just get by, even if you can afford more than just getting by? Or do you provide things that are the best that you could possibly provide, and that there's a long-term benefit for everyone in the family? That was one of the things my father used to say is, cheap is expensive. Mm-hmm. So if you can afford the best thing that you could possibly buy, then it's going to last long, and you're not going to have to keep buying it. So our tools were bought that way. Our home appliances were bought that way, so that they're not constantly going out the door and being thrown into a dump somewhere. Or can it be fixed? And if it could be fixed, the type of vehicles we drove, my father made cars, so we had to have a good car, a good dependable car, and one that was not as polluting. Even back in the 60s, even back in the 70s, we were looking at that, and we talked about that in our household. It was something that we all talked about because my grandparents came from Europe. They they only put out a tiny little bushel of trash at the end of the week, and it was usually cinders from their fireplace.
Wow.
That was it.
I can't imagine doing that. I think that, my partner and I are taking rubbish down constantly. And I try to reduce it. But I don't know how to, I think it's difficult in today's society and just our lifestyles.
Well, and I also think, we have the compost pile and or the worms in the kitchen, or the small little composter that makes compost in 24 hours. Those can be utilized very well in a house and not make as much a waste as you would typically have. Those things are things I think about all the time. We were talking about the glass bottle the other day, and how I used to go to different places to watch how they would clean out their bottles and reuse them and fill them up with milk, for example, or the Pepsi company or the Coke company. We could go and see those, go on a tour and see how they clean the bottles and then refilled them. And to me, that was the most fascinating thing, because it was important that wooden crate at the end of the day was filled with the leftover bottles that were used. And then the company that had this soda would come back and pick them up and take them back to the company. And once they unloaded the truck at the end of the day, it was filled back up with the glass bottles that were empty. It just made sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I mean, I didn't realize, number one, that I knew that milk bottles used to be collected and reused. I didn't realize the same was they did the same for soft drinks. That's so interesting. But I've done other podcasts talking about life cycle thinking, where the producers are also responsible for the waste. And I think that the whole glass bottle thing is, we used to do it. Why don't we still do it? Why don't we still collect the glass bottles and reuse them rather than having all this plastic? It's so much easier. Well, probably not easier, but easier than fixing the problem.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that. And the glass bottles, just because the soda bottles you used to actually get money for. So kids would, that's where they would get their allowance money. They would go and pick up bottles on the street, and they would take them back to their local store, and they would get sometimes a nickel, sometimes a dime, sometimes 2 pennies. But all that added up at the end of the week when you were scavenging for them. And most of the time, if somebody left a bottle behind, it was because they couldn't carry it. Otherwise, people would take their bottles home with them so they could get the money for it.
Yeah.
But this is how children would make extra money for their family or for themselves.
So we're going to move on to what our topic is today, and it is related to what we've just been talking about. But I do like to sort of set out some definitions first so we know what we're talking about. So what is sustainable gardening?
Well, sustainable and regenerative gardening is a way, in other words, when we are constantly controlling things out in nature, we make work for ourselves. We don't allow the landscape to do the work and the heavy lifting. We actually make our work harder because of how we manage. So I'll give an example. When I was studying in England, horticulture, I noticed that we had to do a landscape management plan for how to manage one of the estates. And it was not to mow everything, but just to mow along the edge. Just to mow along the edge so that the edge was tidy and it didn't rub up against your legs when you were walking along a sidewalk, for example, or a street. The rest of the area was left unmowed so that the plants could grow, absorb the moisture, keep areas cooler because they're taller and there's shade. And then sometimes they would mow a pathway through that grassy area or meadow or whatever you want to call it. and you could walk through it to get someplace else. So a trail was cut through it so that it might be a shortcut someplace. But the whole field didn't have to be cut. If it was a playing field for soccer, for football, for Europeans and in Australia, you would intentionally set the parameters for that field. And that field would be maintained so that anybody who wants to play on it can play on it. That's different than mowing everything and expecting to constantly keep everything trimmed down because somebody might be afraid that there might be an animal in that tall grass or there might be an insect that's in there. We've gotten so we micromanage everything. And these ways to unmicromanage actually help the planet and help regeneration. For example, allowing the seed heads on plants to disperse. If it's a good seed, obviously. If it's an invasive seed, you want to always control it. But if it's a good local native plant, why don't you just let the seed disperse itself? That's what it does best. And let it regenerate. We've sometimes have mowed these places so much that there's a lack of seed in these areas because we have mowed them so much and the plants can't regenerate. So we have to come in and help. We have to assist like a midwife. That to me does not make sense.
I know that in Australia, we've got particular companies that they grow turf so that people can have instant lawn. And then my dad has spent so much time, getting our lawn to look just right. He, in the spring, he'll kill all the weeds that have popped up in the grass, and then he'll have to sow all the lawn seed so it grows. And then he's got to mow it, every other week so it doesn't get too long. And so I think what you're saying here is that because Australia isn't really supposed to have lawns like this, it's something that we have to basically import because, we're a really hot, dry place. And the lawns don't grow there naturally. So that's why we have to do so much work. And so if we were to plant something that was more suitable for our area, a very sandy, hot, dry place, we probably wouldn't have to do so much upkeep.
Well, and that's the secret. The idea of working with the locals, if you will, and I'll use an example of people. When you go to vacation somewhere, you always ask the locals, where should we go? Or what should we see? And it's the same thing with plants, You look to see what grows the best in that area and what's local, what's native to that area. And that's what you should be concentrating on planting. And planting it in a way, you can plant it into a garden with a beautiful garden design and feel really good about it. And you could have a small area where you have turf, which takes up a lot less water. But you have the other plants around it doing the tough work. They're doing the heavy lifting. And a lot of plants, especially in dry areas, they have very deep roots. And those roots are so deep that they can actually pull that water to the surface for themselves and for their colleagues in case they don't have as long a root, right? So this is how you can create an environment that is less demanding from us and more demanding on the environment by allowing the native plants to do their thing within the context of the location that they're in.
So if we were to start the process of trying to design or to create a regenerative garden, where would you start? Say I've got a piece of lawn in front of my house. Where do I start?
Well, what I do is I think of the home, the doorway, as the portal. And think of it as a portal. Just think, if your portal's not interesting looking, who wants to come into your portal? Like, I want to be greeted by maybe a few in it. If you're in a dry location, maybe some protea or something that would, really provide interest and also provide insects and birds that might come to the plant that I can actually see up close as I'm coming through this portal, if you will. Around the door is where I'd like to start. And you could start simply by having either containers that are more related to dry plant material, or you can plant directly in the ground close to the door so that you don't have to water those containers. So that would be an area where I would start. I always like to start where you're going to be greeted and then work my way around. And then to areas that need less and you go less to, you put less work into. But we somehow feel like we have to do all this work for every place on the property, even though we don't frequent it very much. So that's what we should be thinking, close up, more intense. As we go further away, less intense, more wild. Maybe the mowing practices change as you get further away. And then even vegetable gardening. If you want to have a vegetable garden, pick a place that you're going to be going to regularly and you're there all the time so that you don't have to go out of your way for it. That is ideal because you'll remember to do any weeding if it needs to be done or any tying up of plants if it needs to be done. But the idea of having things close to the house so that you don't have to go as far makes a lot of sense. And then as you get further away from the doors and the entryways, those areas, you can maybe make a little area, maybe underneath a grove of trees as a little sitting area, but the pathway to it is what you maintain and not everything else.
Okay. I like that. I like this idea of, concentrating, I think, even just on the entrance at first, because as someone who is not into gardening, as someone who doesn't have much experience gardening, I think it can be very overwhelming to think about tackling the whole garden. And so saying, just start with the front door, because I'm going to walk past that every single day and I'm going to see if the plants need watering, if they need something done to them. I'm not having to survey and spend a lot of time checking everything to make sure it's okay. So yeah, that's great. But regenerative gardening isn't just about the design of the garden. What are some other practices that, we need to know about?
So when we talk about the design could be to actually help the plant to regenerate.
Mm-hmm.
So we would leave a little bit more open space so that plant can creep along and have more space to root itself. For example, if something was creeping along the ground and it does really well, perhaps it'll help in stormwater management if you have a really heavy storm. I know here we've had a lot of rains. In really wet areas, plants that love it wet. They like wet feet. You don't want to put a plant that's going to die because it can't handle the water around its roots. So those are the kind of things I think about. And then from a design perspective, or from other than a design, well, everything is really design when you think about it. Less design, less intense design, moving away from the house and start to think about what the plants do. Look at the plants and go to a botanic garden. That's why botanic gardens are so important. You can go to a botanic garden and see how they're growing that plant and see what it does. Even in the tropical houses here in the north, we have in northern the U.S., we have botanical gardens that show how these plants can be grouped together, or they've been in that house for a very long time, and it's a really big plant, and some of the plants kind of get a little bit aggressive, so you start to, cut them back. So you start to watch how things operate, and you read up on this information too. As as an Australian and you look around your landscape, you can see plants that animals go to. They want to be near. They want to take protection under. Those are the kind of things that you might want to consider for your garden because you want to bring in maybe nature closer to your home or maybe further away from the home. Maybe that's on the border of your home. So that you kind of get the idea that, okay, the animals are welcome, but we really don't want them right at the front door. We really don't want people getting, a little frightened. Put that plant further away and we could still enjoy it someplace on the property.
I do remember that reminds me of when I was a child. We had I think it was just a tree in a pot next to the door. And a couple times there was a snake in the pot because it just, I don't know, maybe it was warm in there. And so we had to be quite careful because walking past it, if you disturbed it, it could get scared and bite us. So maybe not planting the snake-friendly plants
Right.
near the house.
Right, exactly. And that would be that really warm, hot location where the snake's going to sun himself. It might be something that's shady, something cooling, what we enjoy rather than the snake enjoys. So, we can think of it that way. And it really makes a huge difference when we're talking about planting and designing. We have non-native plants here in the U.S. And in fact, we have botanic gardens that are starting to bring South African plants up. And some of them can handle the cold winter surprisingly well. And others, no, we just use them as annuals. But the idea of understanding what they do in the landscape allows us to have a little bit more latitude of who we're going to bring in, who we're not going to bring in, who might work well with our native plants and who might not. So those are the kind of things we want to think about too, from a regenerative standpoint, because we don't want things to regenerate that are pushing out our own native plants. We want to make sure that they're not too aggressive. We want things that play nice together. Just, how it is, even with humans, play nice together.
Would you say that we should avoid planting any sort of, non-native plants in our gardens?
Well, again, it depends on its aggressive nature. And I have plenty of non-native plants in my garden, and I love them dearly. For example, Hydrangea paniculata, which is the botanical hydrangea, has really big heads of flowers on it. And I love it in my back garden. I have a small back garden. It's a terrace and patio area. It's crammed with plants. And that when that blooms, I can not only smell the fragrance, because I love it. I can smell it comes through these screen doors when they're open, the sliding doors when they're open. I can smell that fragrance. But I can also go out there and watch all the myriad of pollinators that are there, just going crazy like gangbusters, pollinating it. That to me is so exciting. And, some people would find that's really dull, but to me, it's exciting because I like to do photography. So there's my subject matter right there, waiting for me in the back garden.
Oh, so easy too.
Yeah, very easy.
Okay, so... Sorry?
I just was going to say, I don't have to do much work about that because they come rather than me having to go chase them.
I mean, bring your subject matter to you. Why travel for it?
Exactly.
And it's so great to hear that we can, implement some non-native plants into the landscape or into our gardens, so long as they're not, taking over and being a bit too aggressive with the native plants, or being invasive and spreading too far, because as you said that we like certain things, and we're going to enjoy it more if we have the plants that we really enjoy, so long as they're not doing any damage anywhere else.
I think a good example of that is most of our food products here in North America are non-native. They are non-native, and yet we have them, and we applaud them, and we encourage to plant them. And I think of the one thing that we could not grow 40 years ago here was a fig tree. Unless it was wrapped up in the wintertime and it looked like a mummy. And you think, what the heck is that on the person's front lawn? Are they trying to do sculpture or what is that? Because it would get so cold that they would wrap it up in like towels and sheets and like layers and layers and layers. Now it's hardy here because of the temperature and the microclimates have increased dramatically. We've gone like 2 whole growing zones. And so we can grow figs here. Figs are not native to this area, but guess what? If you have a space for a fig tree and they start coming in at this time of the year, and we're talking August, we're in August 18th, the figs will start coming in. Everybody's talking about the figs in their garden and what they're going to make with their figs. And, they're going to take them to the shelter for people who have never had figs before. I mean, all of this goes on. And that to me is a type of regeneration because we're not only feeding ourselves, we're feeding somebody else, and it will come back next year.
Okay. So yeah, regeneration isn't just native plants. That's so cool.
Not just native plants.
Yeah. You also mentioned climate change and how that's changing the environment. So that's a big problem that, we can't tackle on our own. But can we use regenerative gardening to tackle it a little bit? Or, can we use regenerative gardening to help us and also help our planet?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's all about the one person doing one thing or 2 things or 3 things that actually change the paradigm. And example, less mowing. Allow the natural plants to come up. I was thinking of dandelions, non-native. Cow's milk is much richer with dandelions. The leaves are edible for humans, but you can also make wine from the flowers. And again, you can have those on your lawn, and they could have some things that are taller along with it. Most definitely have a lawn that looks and a landscape that looks native with non-natives in it from that type of regeneration.
Mm-hmm. And so how does having dandelions in the garden, how does that improve, what benefits does that have other than looking nice?
Well, there is something that's really fascinating about a dandelion. It has a very long root system. Mm-hmm. And the long root systems have the capacity to pull up water from down below that may not be available. It might be really, really dry. And those dandelion roots are pulling up that moisture to bring up to the surface, and other plants can benefit from it. So it may not just be it's a non-native, but it's bringing up something that might not be able to be brought up otherwise, especially in a lawn, for example.
Okay, so it's a non-native, but it is actually, I guess, helping the native plants to thrive because it's bringing in that water.
Yeah, and it's also making a hole that root goes down and penetrates the ground. It's opening up the soil and providing other seeds to grow nearby. I was thinking about a client that I have in California, and they have very dry location there. They're in Los Angeles. And in talking with them, they had a problem because somebody had put cloth, landscape fabric on everything in the garden. I mean, it's like just the worst thing that's possibly could be done. And to prevent weeds from coming up, which is crazy. But anyway, their tree started to die back because the water system, it was on a sprinkler and it was drowning the roots. So I said to them, this is what you need to do. So I told them, you have to take the fabric off, drill down into the soil, pull the soil out, get a soil test done. And then there's this thing called bumper crop, it has mycorrhiza in it. And I said, spread it underneath the whole entire tree and, a good 2 inches and fill in the holes there too, that you just pulled soil from. And then I want you to plant clover on this spot underneath your avocado tree. And plant clover because your soil test says that you have low nitrogen. And clover provides the bacteria on the root systems create these nitrogen nodules so that nitrogen's available in the soil. So they did all that. And about a year later, they sent me a picture and said, take a look at our tree. We cannot believe it. It is just growing like crazy. The clover is as happy as can be. We don't have to do any weeding underneath it because the clover has formed one big mat of flowers and foliage, and the tree is as happy as a clam.
Amazing.
And it was blooming, getting new foliage, flowering, can't get better than that. So you're providing a system the plant's not isolated by itself and not depending on humans to constantly intervene. It's almost egotistical to be that way, to have everything expect humans to intervene from a nature perspective.
Mm. But in that case, it seems like you did have to do some testing to figure out what was wrong with the tree. I mean, I guess the water part was possibly self-evident, by how much water there was, but the nitrogen, maybe not so evident. So would you say that, your average gardener is going to have trouble to figure out these things, or they need to find professional help for these things?
I think, and I'm not sure in Australia whether we have land grant universities here that provide the service of accepting a soil test. But there's also companies that do it too, where you can take your soil test and it just says, you look up and you say, how do I do a soil test? And you look that up online and it'll tell you exactly how to do a soil test. And then you collect the soil, dry it out, put it in a bag, and you send it off to whoever's going to be doing the testing. And then that comes back with a beautiful sheet of all the information that you need for your property. Because a lot of times when we move into a home or a property that we have no knowledge of previously, like what was there. If I know that it was a cow farm, there was cows in the pasture, I'll know that it has high nitrogen. That's one thing. But if I'm moving onto a property, I have no clue as to what's there. The soil test is going to help me to determine what is needed or maybe not needed at all. So really easy.
Okay.
Easy
and then
peasy.
I guess after that, then you can, say you can Google my soil is low in nitrogen. What do I do? And then it'll come up with clover.
You can say holistic approaches without fertilizer. And then clover would be one. And there's lots of different types of clover you can use. But I gave them the small flowered form, which looks nice. It's white and it has a really pretty green background. But you can get red clover too, which gets much taller underneath a tree. I didn't think that would be as appropriate as the low growing one. So yeah, so you can. There's lots of information, especially now with the web. We can Google almost anything and find information. But what I would recommend, if you're looking for information, always go to either a known source, for example, a university site, a research facility, some place that has credibility. If you go to some other place, you might not be getting what you need when it comes to plants.
I'm guessing it's also going to be a little bit like place specific. Like you probably want to, I'm in Australia, go to an Australian university rather than a US university.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And here we have our land grant here in Pennsylvania. Penn State does soil testing. We also have it in Massachusetts and California. All these different places have it. And because we have the U.S. soil, I'm just want to make sure that I get this right. There's a website where you can go to where it shows all the soils in the United States. And you can see what kind of soils are everywhere. Oh, that's clay in that area, or it's sandy in this area, or it's a mix of clay and sand in this area. So it'll actually tell you the type of rock, the type of bedrock, if it's more acidic versus calicitic. You get all that. And I'm sure that Australia has something like that.
And if you don't mind, do you mind sending us the link for their website later on, and we'll put it in the show notes?
Sure. I'll make a note of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's fun. It's really fun because I've taken a lot of soil and geology classes, and I thought, oh my, this is really wonderful. And to also study rock too. And in Australia, you have some amazing rock formations. Amazing rock formations.
I don't know much about them, to be honest.
Some very old, some of the oldest rock formations are found in Australia, from what I understand. So yeah, really.
Yeah. I'll have to see if we've got something similar in Australia, and I'll learn a whole bunch about our ground.
Yes.
And you also mentioned like holistic, what was it? Holistic fertilizers, or what is that?
So when you talk about, there's before, I would say after World War II, when fertilizers started to come in strong because they didn't know what to do with all the extra nitrogen from the military. That's when we started to fertilize. It was a way to get rid of something, but then they wound up creating a whole industry of making something. So you can utilize things in a more holistic way by looking at what plants provide what. So some plants that are in the legume family, which is the bean, has the nodules for the nitrogen. And it's a bacteria, they found out, is a bacteria that's connected to the root system that actually helps to make that nodule form. So knowing that there's a whole range of plants that produce nitrogen, that in itself is like gold, because we don't have to apply chemical fertilizers. We can actually use grass clippings, for example. Grass clippings. You can use, again, the clover idea, or beans, how they rotate crops in fields. They'll put beans in, then they'll put corn, then they'll put something else, and then they'll come back to the beans again because they're providing nitrogen. But you'll note that you can find the information out. What does this plant use a lot of? Are you going to use, maybe you need some potassium or phosphorus and chicken manure, or are you going to need more nitrogen? Okay, cow manure. You can use cow manure in place of that nitrogen in the bean, because it's going to allow it to get into the soil faster, for example. But there's lots of different things out there that we don't have to go to fertilizers for. I'm not saying all fertilizers are bad, but I'm just saying that you can find regenerative forms. Like, for example, fish, ground up fish heads used in your garden. Of course, it may smell, but it's providing a nutrient. They actually mix that into some of the fertilizers, or what we classify as the soils, actually the soils that they make or blend with compost and core, which is the coconut core that comes from that product. All of that can get mixed into making a soil that has all these nutrients in it without having to add fertilizers.
Interesting.
They're fascinating.
So I don't know anything about gardening, and particularly regenerative gardening seems quite out of my reach. You've given some quite easy ways to start, but I'm still a bit scared. Do you think that I, a beginner, or anyone else could, start regenerative gardening?
Absolutely. And if you can crack an egg and take that egg shell and take a trowel and put it into the ground, you start regeneration. You've taken that calcium covering and put it into an area that may need calcium in the soil. So you could put your eggshells in there, or put it into a potted plant that needs a higher pH, for example. or putting that eggshell into a compost and letting it break down so that it kind of works its way through that soil mix. Doesn't have to be a lot. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to overthink it. You just need to have the will to do it. Mm-hmm. And the idea of doing it, and it could be something that you time during the day if you're talking about home economics. It might be every time you have, at the end of the day, you take that little pail that's in your kitchen that you have collected all your trimmings from your vegetables, no meats, no cheeses, and take that and put that out into a little pile in the back garden, and turn it around, maybe put some dry leaves into it, and let it sit there and see what happens. And then after a little while, turn it again a couple times, and then come back to it and keep adding to it and turning it. And eventually you're going to have a really nice compost that could be utilized on your plants and in your flower beds. Simple, easy peasy, and no expense to you because you've already spent it on your vegetables to eat, right?
Yep. I was already going to buy it and throw it out anyway. So it's just added value.
That's exactly right. So it's about reutilizing everything that we use. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if I decide I'm not going to, if I have a lot of weeds in my garden, I'm going to use the cardboard that I just got something in from my shipper, and I'm going to pull that cardboard apart. I'm going to lay that cardboard on top of my weedy area, and I'm going to put compost or mulch on top of it, and it's going to smother those weeds. Those weeds are going to provide nitrogen to my soil because they were green. And now I'm going to just let that soil, that whole process sit there for a little while. And then, especially if it's the fall, it's great to do that in the fall going into the winter, because then over the winter, that whole process has a better chance of breaking down. And then come spring, that cardboard's already falling apart, and you just make a hole, put your plant in, done. Mm-hmm. And the cardboard or newspaper leaves a layer in between the soil below and the mulch and whatever else you have on the top. And it keeps the moisture of the soil consistent, keeps the temperature consistent. And that way you don't have these huge swings in temperatures in the soil for your plant root system.
Okay, so yeah, anyone can start, even if it's just a little bit of composting and putting an eggshell in a pot. I'm going to be trying that because I've got a lot of little pot plants that are honestly not looking so good. And I think it might be they need a little bit extra oomph from eggshell, maybe some coffee, I don't know.
Well, coffee, I was just going to say coffee grounds or leftover coffee in the coffee pot. Don't spill it down the drain. Use it, put it onto your compost. You could put it onto your compost pile or tea bags, that kind of thing. They'll break down and you'll have all that wonderful additional material for your compost.
Great, thank you. I'll be trying that. But I'd like to know as well, what is something that you do in your own garden to manage your garden and that our listeners can try out?
Well, the first thing I did when I moved into this particular house was I brought plants from my previous house. Mm-hmm. And I did exactly what I was just telling you about with the newspaper and the cardboard. I planted the plants in the ground. There was grass. So what I did was I turned over the ground and I pulled the grass out and turned that over and then put the plant in the hole and then put the newspaper and cardboard right up to the plant and then mulched that little mound and then continued on with all the other plants in the garden. And like within a couple hours, my garden was made. Okay. And it took a day, but from start to finish. But the area is a decent size, and people were like shocked. They were like, "What? I can't believe that there's a garden in the back here. There wasn't a garden here yesterday. Now there's a whole garden." Yeah, and I do have flower pots. I've got a lot of plants that are in pots because I do trials for companies, and I test them to see how the plants are functioning. Do they work well? Do they bloom well? Can they take a little bit of dryness because I forgot to water? So yeah, and I do those practices. And the other thing that I do is occasionally I'll edge the edge of my bed so that where the lawn is, there's a nice divide. And I also like to keep that. And sometimes I'll use pine cones and fill that area with pine cones as a mulch. Or I'll put pine cones on the top of my containers as a mulch rather than as a regular mulch that I would have to buy. I'll use pine cones because there's lots of layers in that pine cone, and it'll keep the moisture in the ground. So I'll do that to make it look interesting.
Yeah. But pine cones, they have seeds in them, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Would you grow a pine tree by accident?
I actually, all of a sudden, I see these little pine trees coming up, and I'll transplant them and put them into another pot, and then I'll give them away as gifts, or so somebody else can plant a tree in their property.
Okay, so it's not.
I don't like to let that go to waste.
I could just imagine, what I would do is I'd probably, take your advice, use pine cones to mulch, and then, they'd grow a bit. I'd be like, oh no, I've got all these trees. I don't know what to do with them. And then I think I'd just have this little grove of pine trees.
And you might have a little grove of pine trees, but you could always pass it on to somebody who needs them for their property.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll start a pine tree business.
There you go.
And so you said that you trim the grass a bit and you put some mulch down. How often do you do this?
I only do it once a year.
Mm-hmm.
I do it in the springtime. I'll go out and weed. I'll go out and weed whenever I see weeds there. I don't make a big deal about it. I mean, I just weed when I see a weed. Rarely do I see a weed in my garden because everything's so close together. Everything kind of intermingles with one another. Some people are afraid to have their plants touch. I think it's really important to realize that plants are made to grow together as like a unit where they're coming together and meshing. And the stronger the mesh, the better it is, because weeds won't get into your garden bed. They won't overtake anything in your garden. So my whole garden's that way. It's very intricate. There's pots in places that are bare, so I'll tuck that in. I'll tuck in a plant. If I see a little spot that something died, I'll put something else in so that there's never any soil showing or mulch showing. Everything is covered.
And I guess that's what it's like in nature. We don't have lovely little pots or little rows of plants when you're in nature. They're all kind of, meshed into each other and overlapping and growing out of each other.
Yeah. And if you went into a woodland, unless there was a clear path made, like by the deer in our area, we have deer that actually open up the little pathways. You can actually see where the deer go, and you just follow those deer paths, and that's how you get into the woods. And that's how even many of our roads were developed, because we followed either the Indian trails or the deer paths.
Interesting. So we're going to move on to the open mic section next. So that's where you get a chance to talk about something that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to our topic today, but it can be related if you like. Did you have something in mind?
Well, I really wanted to talk about the climate crisis, and I think we need to talk about it in a way that everyone can understand it. It's not a fake thing. It's happening, and it's happening faster and faster. Our whole earth is speeding up. And as a former professor at a university teaching woody plants, and I still teach woody plants every year, I look at those plants and I say, are they responding this year the way they did last year and the year before and the year before that? And if the answer is no, Why are they responding differently this year than they did last year? And are they fruiting at the same time that they did last year and the year before and the year before and the year before? And if they're not, why not? And I'll give you a really good example. I used to have a pawpaw tree in the back of my office. Now, pawpaw is the northernmost tropical fruit, and it's related to, I think it's the mango, and it's a large fruit, about maybe about 6 inches, and it usually drops its fruit, or did drop its fruit, around the first week of September, first 2 weeks of September, maybe a little bit later, depending on how hot our summers were and how dry they were. But usually it was in September. And then over time, when I was at the university for over 12 years, I noticed that the pawpaw was dropping earlier in August. And it didn't drop all of its fruit like it normally did in 2 weeks. The 1 year, it held it all the way into December. Now, why would the tree hold its fruit into December when it's clearly not normal to do that? The flags go up. As a faculty, I talk to the students about this. I say, what do you think's happening? What should we think here? Is it because we've had an unusual year? Has it been too warm, too cold? What's going on? Is there different animal activity, because they're usually associated and rely on animals to carry their seed in their guano? So maybe there's an animal shift. Okay, this next year happens. It happens again, but it doesn't wait as long to drop. It waits until November. Okay, November, it's done dropping, but there's still 3 whole months that it's dropping. That's not normal. And you start to see these things blooming earlier or blooming later, holding their fruit longer or dropping their fruit earlier. These are signs that something is going on around us. It's not political. It's not anything like that. It's observation. And that starts to create a pattern. And there's a thing called phenology. Phenology charts are the listing of what's the plant doing when. And it's these phenology charts that are so valuable for us to look at and say, well, look, 10 years ago, this is when the plant was blooming, and now it's moved itself up 3 weeks. Okay? That's crazy. Something's going on. It's getting warmer. It could be getting colder, or it could be getting drier, or it could be getting wetter. And these are the things we look at in science. What's the phenology of the plant? And if the phenology changes dramatically, there's something wrong environmentally. And then we have to raise a flag. And woody plant teachers are one of the very first people on the front line to see this happening, because we're out in the field all the time and we're looking at these plants and saying something's not right. That's where we can. So the climate crisis is real, number one. Number two, we can make changes in how we operate by what we do physically and mentally, to not only to ourselves, but to the Earth's surface, to our planet, our home. We can just make these few regenerative moves and it will shift the paradigm. That's where we need to go in order to create a better, more consistent phenology, if you will. Because if our plants aren't blooming when we're hungry, or they're not fruiting when we're hungry, what do? What if the food isn't going to come in when we want it to come in? What do? We're reliant on food, and other animals are reliant on food. And if it doesn't come in a consistent, reliable basis, we're in trouble. And that's another red flag. And I think the third red flag is that we've been clear cutting so many trees on the Earth's surface that it's getting hotter, because that is our way to temper the environment. And being able to plant trees and have environments that we don't penetrate because we value them as cooling systems, we would be better off. And that's what we can do if we really put an effort into it.
So I guess, taking that stand and, talking to the government, making clear what we want by saying no clear cutting, climate change is real. By doing those things, we can, at least try to affect change so that we don't end up, in a much worse climate crisis.
That's exactly right. And that's what they're doing right now in Brazil, now with a new president who's saying no more clear cutting, and we're going to be going in and planting. We're also seeing the use of the Miyawaki method of planting these dense, small little forests, and they're only the size of a tennis court. But in that, if we can keep building those tiny little ones and we keep creating those little spaces, those are acting as little cooling agents for our planet.
Okay. So, and I guess what we could do is we can plant our gardens full of lovely, thick plants and try and affect change there. We
certainly can, and a diverse planting too. Don't be afraid to plant diversity, because diversity will keep a more balanced environment with our insect population, our birds. It'll provide food for the birds and the insects, and that way we can all be happier. We can all live happier.
And thank you for that. I do have a few recommendations for our listeners if you are interested in some more of these things. I spoke to Liz Friesen about vermicomposting. So that's composting with worms if you want to learn more about that. I also spoke to Julie Travaglini, who talked about sustainable home landscaping. So getting a bit more into the nitty-gritty and how to do these things. So thank you so much for talking to me today. If people do want to find out more about you, where should they find you?
You can Google me at evamonheim.com. That's my website. You can also find this Eva Monheim Instagram. I have all kinds of plant videos on there where you can listen to them and you can learn about trees. And I'm also on, let me see. I also have my the podcast, the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, which is also another good resource for you if you're interested in finding out how we're fighting the climate crisis on the podcast. That's the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast.com. And we have connectors to that too through Facebook and Instagram and TikTok.
Great, thank you. We'll make sure to put all of those links in our show notes so everyone can find them easily and they can find your podcast and give it a listen. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate it.
It was great to have you.
Thanks.
You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Joustra. Thanks for tuning in.